Hi, welcome to English 101, and we are reading a book called Monsters. We are today starting chapter 1. Okay, now chapter 1, the title is Why Do We Create Monsters? In other words, in all honesty, it is we, humans, who create the monsters that terrorize us. Why do we do that? I mean, it seems a little antithetical to our peace and goodwill, right? To always sort of envision these horrible creatures of various types. You know, we've always done that as people, as humans, across the world, across time, different places, different cultures, different religions, all kinds of different social groups, and we all have monsters of all kinds. And so this is a deeply interesting question. It's part of the foundation of the whole course, and it's one of the reasons why we get started with it right up in chapter 1. You know, it's funny, we can, there are some monsters that we have that we can very specifically label where it came from, when it appeared. There are others that are far more mysterious in their origins, yet here they are. Or there they were. After all, monsters don't always last, right? Sometimes they just kind of fade away, right? So we're going to examine that. Now, when you start the class, when you begin now, right, you should, of course, read the introduction for students, since, after all, that's what it's there for, to introduce the students to the material. But once we get past that, now we're ready to dive into things. The first article is called Why We Crave Horror Movies by Stephen King. You may have heard of Mr. King, right? Stephen King is probably the most famous living author writing in English of horror fiction. I mean, it's debatable, but I think a very strong argument could be made for Stephen King. This is a very short piece that he wrote many years ago, in which he tries to answer this very question. Why do we like horror? Why do we seem to need it? Now, I'll grant you straight up, not everybody likes horror. In fact, that's one of the questions that Stephen King looks at in this essay. Why do some people like it and some people not? And he posits some very interesting ideas about that. But fundamentally, one of the things that Stephen King asks us to consider is, again, ourselves. We bring out the horror. It's inside of us already. Right? The alligators in the basement, as he refers to it. It's a little kind of Freudian, right? That concept of the id. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but certainly I would say this. I mean, my fellow faculty members in psychology kind of look at me very much askance when I talk about Freud, because he's not very popular anymore. Most people think he's kind of full of it. But from a literary perspective, from the point of view of fiction, and a lot of explanations do kind of run through Freud. Issues like death drive and the id as a part of our psyche, which is these kind of unrestrained desires. What I call a 4-year-old that's sexual. I want. There's something there. There's something very interesting about this need to be scared, this need to be thrilled, this need to have something that we are indeed afraid of. Now the next piece, very, very short passage from Frankenstein, A Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. Now, Frankenstein, by the way, is the doctor, not the creature. Now, I know in popular culture, when people say Frankenstein, we immediately think of the Boris Karloff style looking Frankenstein, electrodes coming out of the neck, right? All that kind of stuff. If you've ever read the book, or even a movie that was based more closely on the book, or watched one of those movies, like I believe Robert De Niro plays the creature with Kenneth Branagh in a more accurate, if you want to call it, movie version of the Frankenstein story. Now, who's Prometheus, a modern Prometheus? Prometheus is a figure from Greek mythology, ancient Greece. And essentially, Prometheus is the character, a god, a titan, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, who disobeyed Zeus. Zeus, of course, was like the king of the gods. And Zeus had people living in darkness. Human beings were terrified. And that's how Zeus wanted to keep it. Prometheus brings to people fire. And symbolically, right, by having fire, right, people are capable of creating civilization. Prometheus is punished for doing this, for disobeying Zeus. And what Prometheus does, or what Zeus does to Prometheus, is he has him chained to a rock at the top of a mountain. And vultures come and eat out his liver every day. And every night, it grows back. So the suffering is eternal. Wow. It's quite a story. Mary Shelley created this story of Frankenstein that we know. And the passage that we have here, it's a brief passage, but it's a passage in which the creature wakes up for the first time. Now, if you're familiar with the original movie from the 1930s, or even just, ideas that come from that movie that maybe even if you've never seen the movie itself, you're probably well aware of. In the movie, Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, is triumphant. It's alive! It's alive, right? He's screaming, it's alive. I mean, it's like a joke to use that now, right? But in the story that Mary Shelley wrote, the doctor is not at all triumphant. He's terrified. And he literally runs away from his creation. God creates Adam and Eve in the story of Genesis, right? Creates Adam and then Eve. Well, we don't need to get into the details. And he puts them in Eden, this beautiful, idyllic paradise, to take care of them. But if Dr. Frankenstein is a godlike person, creating life out of death, he's not very godlike in his response once he's successful. As I said, he literally runs away. He abandons his creation. Susan Tyler Hitchcock, in the piece called Conception, tells us more about the origin story of the Frankenstein novel, right, that Mary Shelley wrote. And she talks about what is, at least amongst English majors, a very famous story, where Lord Byron, who was a famous poet, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley's lover and later husband, also a famous poet, and Mary, and this guy named John Polidori, and Mary's half-sister, are in Geneva, Switzerland. And they're hanging out, and they got no Wi-Fi, no cable TV. I mean, what did people do in the 19th century? Oh my God. You know what they did? They talked. and they read stories. And so they are, in fact, literally reading stories to each other at night. Ghost stories, horror stories of their time. And Byron gets so upset with these stories because they're not very good. And he says, any one of us can do better. And they agree to a contest. Who can think up the best horror story? Now, I want you to read the whole thing because I don't want to give much away. But two things actually come out of this horror story. This challenge, the Frankenstein myth that we know of, but also the modern vampire. Modern vampire. Now, a lot of people will say, no, that's Bram Stoker, Dracula. And that's certainly true. But John Polidori wrote a piece called The Vampire, which was really the first piece of literature that fused together the idea of a blood-sucking monster, which had been around for a very long time. I mean, thousands of years. But turning that blood-sucking monster into an attractive, seductive male figure, right? Which Stoker changes into, Count Dracula about 80 years later. Very interesting story. So we can actually nail down the beginning of two central, huge monster stories that we have with us now. Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan wrote a piece called Why Vampires Never Die. If you're familiar with movies, Guillermo del Toro, of course, has been responsible, directed quite a number of very interesting movies, including Pan's Labyrinth and The Shape of Water. And he's worked with Chuck Hogan. So they're talking here a little bit more about the vampire and the idea of the vampire. And they also talk about John Polidori, by the way. Chuck Klosterman is writing a piece called My Zombie Myself, Why Modern Life Feels Rather Undead. The zombie myth, is a pretty old story, but it does have certain origin areas, including Haiti, the idea of voodoo. What he's interested in is this idea of why we seem so fascinated with the zombie myth. Are we zombies? In our modern life, walking around with our screens in front of us, not paying attention to the world around us. I mean, I see this all the time. People with earbuds in, looking at their phones. They could be walking the surface of Mars for all they know, right? Or are zombies the daily tasks and grind that we all have to deal with? Monsters coming at us each and every flippin' day. Peter Brothers writes about Godzilla, another story with a very easy to recognize origin. Godzilla comes from a movie made 9 short years after the end of World War II, in which we, the United States, aka the good guys, dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the trauma for the Japanese people that resulted out of this is reflected in the Godzilla story. There's a new sheriff in town. We call that the internet, right? So in Mary Shelley's time, there was just writing. As I said, no TV, no movies. By the time we get to Godzilla, we have movies, of course, right? So Honda, the director, creates this movie called Godzilla and a monster that's fit for it. Now we have the internet, and the internet has given us new monsters, including Slender Man, that Clarice Lowry talks about. And that's a very interesting thing. What does the internet give in terms of an ability to create new monsters? Lastly is Stephen Asma, Monsters in the Moral Imagination. He's not talking about any specific monsters now. He's kind of going back to what Stephen King opened up. Why do we create monsters? Why do we seem to need monsters? What role do they play in our imaginations? How do they tell us what to do and what not to do? How do they prepare us for evil in the world that's incredibly real?